The latest drafted MVP ever, a bust-turned all-star at first overall, another MVP in the top 5, multiple career redemption stories, crazy draft night trades. The 2014 NBA draft had it all as one of the most insane draft classes of the decade. So what happened to all of these guys? Starting out hot at first overall with Andrew Wiggins. Believe it or not, even in a draft class that includes multiple MVPs, Wiggins was seen as the consensus first overall pick in this draft. He was a highly touted high school player that had a good freshman season at Kansas, and his NBA potential seemed almost limitless. He had ideal size as a wing, great athleticism, and an evolving offensive game. Think basically what Jason Tatum has become in Boston. That's what people thought Wiggins could be as a pro. There was some consideration given to Jabari Parker and Joel Embiid for first overall, but I'm going to get to them in a second. This was also a very weird situation for a first overall pick, as LeBron rejoined the Cavs in the 2014 offseason and never once mentioned Wiggins as a piece that he was excited to play alongside, all but guaranteeing that the first pick wouldn't stay in Cleveland for long as LeBron tried to push for a title. Ultimately, Wiggins was the player that went first and would start his career in Minnesota, as he was sent to the Timberwolves in a package for Kevin Love to the Cavs, and they were simply terrible. Minnesota won just 16 games in Wiggins' rookie season with a very young roster, but Wiggins looked good. He was exactly what he was supposed to be, an athletic wing scorer with two-way upside, and averaging almost 17 points per game as a 19-year-old is not easy to do. The future looked bright. Same thing in year 2 with his scoring going up to over 20 points per game, in year 3 over 23 points per game. At just 21 years old, Wiggins had played all 82 games, was 16th in points per game in the entire league with respectable efficiency. Again, exactly what he was supposed to be as a highly touted first overall pick. The problems started the next season, however. In the 2017 offseason, the Timberwolves accelerated their rebuild and traded for Jimmy Butler, completely changing the hierarchy of the team. It was no longer Wiggins, Levine, Cat, and the young guys just scoring points. Now they had to play around Butler and actually win some games, and the flaws in Wiggins' game really started to show. He wasn't a good playmaker, wasn't a good off-ball spacer, and hadn't developed much defensively either despite his athleticism. What followed was a shocking fall off in both scoring and confidence, right as Minnesota handed Wiggins a massive max contract. Butler wouldn't last long in Minnesota, but neither would Wiggins, and the damage was done. As his game continued to fall apart, it became clear that Cat was the future and Wiggins needed a new home. As a result, at just 24 years old, they gave up on him and sent him to the Warriors in 2020, attaching a first-round pick with him to get D'Angelo Russell in exchange. At the time, given his play and his contract, Wiggins was viewed as one of the worst assets in the entire league, and the Warriors were taking a huge risk by adding him to their team. As it turned out, though, it was the best thing that could have happened to him. He found his role as a high-energy two-way wing, became a great defensive player and rebounder, and gained confidence as a shooter. As of this recording, shooting over 38% from three-point range with the Warriors. Almost immediately, he became a valuable contributor to a championship team, not to mention an all-star starter, and Golden State would not have won the title in 2021 without the trade for Wiggins a few years prior. He hasn't been able to get back to those elite scoring numbers, but he certainly has redeemed himself as a winning player, a stunning turnaround for a player that so many had given up on early in his career. Next up now is one of the most overlooked players in the history of the NBA, Jabari Parker. I mentioned earlier that there was some talk about Parker as the first pick in this draft, and although it wasn't a huge debate, it was discussed. He was simply a more impressive player in college as a freshman, especially offensively, and it looked like he would be an all-star forward for years to come. The problem was he was a liability defensively and kind of didn't have a true position, and Wiggins' athleticism made him appear to have a higher ceiling at the NBA level. And honestly, I fully believe Parker would have been a multiple-time all-star and maybe even one of the best frontcourt players in the league if his career had gone differently. He was such a powerful yet skilled scorer and had flashes of brilliance, but injuries ruined his career. The Bucks picked him at second overall, and pretty much everyone agreed that that was the right choice, but he played just 183 games in Milwaukee and only played in more than 55 games in a single season one time. At just 310 career NBA games and leaving the league at just 26 years old, it's truly one of the most disappointing careers of the decade. All you have to do is look at his third season in the league to see what kind of player he could have been. An efficient 20 points per game, expanding his range to the three-point line, punishing in the paint, a developing playmaker, such a fun and talented player, and he could just never stay healthy. After a few seasons, it was clear that he was never going to reach his potential, and by that point, Giannis had passed Parker as the future of the franchise, and after just 4 seasons, he was gone from Milwaukee. He bounced around to a few teams trying to stick around in the league, but it just wasn't meant to be. This is truly one of the biggest what-ifs of the decade because Giannis was awesome. The Bucks still built a title-winning team, and all of that was without this incredibly promising second overall pick, what could have been for the Bucks. Moving on now to Wiggins' college teammate at Kansas and the mystery man of this draft, Joel Embiid. It might seem strange now that in 2014 Embiid wasn't really considered the first pick in this draft, but it all made sense at the time. There were people out there that saw his defensive instincts, size, and evolving offensive game and saw a future all-star, and his potential at the NBA level was insane. The problem was he wasn't healthy. He had foot surgery before the draft, and anytime you're dealing with a big guy with lower body injuries, it's kind of tough to commit high-level draft capital to that player and risk them never getting healthy. And that uncertainty allowed the Sixers to get arguably the best prospect in the draft at the time at third overall. Of course, nobody knew if he was going to be any good because he basically didn't play at all for years after the draft. It's easy to forget this now that Embiid has been healthy for years, but there was a time when it looked like he would never be healthy enough to be a big-time NBA player. He was drafted at 20 years old and didn't make his NBA debut until he was 22. And even in his rookie season, he only played 31 games and 25 minutes per game. But what was clear at the time was that if he could get healthy, the Sixers had a special player on their hands. He averaged 20 points per game as a rookie, even with limited playing time, and continued to grow and evolve his game, which wasn't easy in Philadelphia at the time. They were still growing through the early parts of the process, which was helped by the fact that Embiid wasn't playing those first 2 years. But eventually in his fourth season, it all came together for him. He played in 63 games that season, then 64 the year after that, and he was on the path to an eventual MVP. Despite some ups and downs, roster and coaching changes, and a ton of other drama in Philly, Embiid has been the one constant for the organization, winning back-to-back scoring titles in 2022 and 2023, and of course an MVP as well. A truly remarkable ascension to one of the best players in the league, considering how uncertain the start of his NBA career was. Moving on now to a prospect that a lot of people loved at the time, Aaron Gordon. He was maybe the most athletic player in the entire class, and a lot of people were excited about what he could be as a combo forward in the NBA. Of course, as most big-time athletes did in this era, Gordon ended up in Orlando, which turns out to be terrible for him, honestly. They spent years trying to find decent guards and good spacing, both of which were going to be essential in helping Gordon succeed at the NBA level, and they never really found it. What they did have were a ton of frontcourt players, which meant that for his entire career in Orlando, Gordon played out of position at the three. And somehow he was still successful individually. He put up decent stats and made himself into a good scorer and two-way player, but the team was always pretty terrible. But then after 6 seasons of being in a bad situation, he ended up in the best one possible. In 2021, the Magic traded Gordon to the Nuggets, and suddenly he was exactly who he was supposed to be as an NBA player. He played great defense, attacked the glass, got to the rim, and made an occasional jump shot, all while playing alongside the best player in the league in Nikola Jokic and winning an NBA title, making Gordon's story one of my favorites in the entire class. He wasn't put in a position to succeed with the Magic, but managed to develop his game anyway, and his reputation as a player changed completely once he got to Denver. Moving on now to number 5, Dante Exum of the Utah Jazz. As a prospect, Exum was certainly a project. There was a lot of risk in taking him with a top 5 pick as an unproven international guy, but he was extremely talented. He had elite length and athleticism for a guard and would at the very least project as a high-level defensive player with some offensive upside. The Jazz at the time were willing to take a big swing like this, considering they were a young developing team anyway, and a lot of people liked this selection at number 5 as a result. The problem was Exum never developed all of that potential that scouts saw in him. He was fine as a rookie, showing some flashes as a 19-year-old playing over 20 minutes per game, but his offensive game was extremely limited. Then in year 2, a knee injury cost him the entire season and pretty much derailed his career. For a few more seasons in Utah, Exum battled a variety of injuries and just never became a good offensive player, especially as a floor spacer. His defensive ceiling was still really high, but it became clear he was going to have a hard time finding minutes on an up-and-coming Jazz team if he was a complete zero on offense. After 5 seasons in Utah, he was traded to the Cavs, and after just 30 games there in 2 seasons, he decided to continue his basketball career overseas. As of this recording, he has returned to the NBA with the Dallas Mavericks, and he's had some really intriguing moments in international play, but a lack of offensive development continues to prevent him from becoming a big-time NBA player. Such a disappointment for a really promising player. Next up is one of the more interesting guys in this class, Marcus Smart. It might seem strange now, but he was viewed completely differently as a prospect compared to the player that he became at the NBA level. In fact, the year before, there was actually some buzz that he could have been viewed as the first overall pick in the pretty terrible 2013 draft had he decided to leave school then, and he was seen as an actual point guard as a prospect. The Celtics, meanwhile, were in an interesting spot in 2014 as they transitioned out of the Garnett and Pierce era into a complete rebuild, and Smart was drafted into a backcourt that featured Avery Bradley, and then later in his rookie season, they traded for Isaiah Thomas. Ultimately, this turned out to be an awesome pick by the Celtics, considering who else was drafted around smart, and even though he had ups and downs in Boston, especially in terms of his efficiency, his hustle and defensive instincts made him a valuable player for years. Speaking of ups and downs, next up at number 7 is Julius Randle. The Lakers held this pick and were struggling to transition into a new era and desperately needed some young talent. Randle was a really interesting prospect, a bruising forward with perimeter skill that projected as a potential high-level scorer and all-star. His fit at the NBA level was a bit weird considering he wasn't a perimeter spacer and defensively he wasn't great, but there was certainly enough talent to justify a top 10 selection. Unfortunately for Randle, his NBA career got off to pretty much the worst possible start, suffering a season-ending injury just 14 minutes into his first game as a rookie. But he did come back strong in year 2, and over the next couple of seasons in LA, it was clear that he had the talent to be a really good player, especially as a scorer, but for whatever reason, he could never fully establish himself as a franchise cornerstone moving forward for LA. Granted, this was a strange era for Lakers basketball, and there were plenty of bad decisions being made by the front office at the time, but ultimately, after 4 seasons with the Lakers, they decided not to bring back Randle in free agency, despite posting career highs in his 4th season and playing in every game. Randle ended up signing a new deal with the Pelicans, and immediately it was clear that the Lakers had made a mistake. He put up huge scoring numbers and established himself as a big-time free agent in the 2019 class. The Knicks stepped up that summer and offered Randle his first big contract of his career, and in New York, he finally established himself as an all-star and one of the best front-court players in the conference. There have certainly been some issues for Randle at times in New York, but his talent as an offensive player has never been in question. I know Knicks fans get frustrated with him at times, but when you look at how his career started with the injury and the weird situation with the Lakers, it's really impressive how he managed to still put together a great NBA career. Next up is where this draft starts to get pretty rough. The Kings were picking at number 8 here, and as always, they were a terrible team looking to add some talent. They had DeMarcus Cousins and a few other recently highly drafted players and went with Nick Stauskas with the 8th overall pick. Stauskas was coming off of a really good college season at Michigan and projected as worst case a high-level shooter and role player with enough offensive upside to maybe justify a top 10 selection. Unfortunately, he just never figured it out in the NBA. He averaged just over 4 points per game as a rookie and lasted just 1 season and 73 games in Sacramento before being traded the following offseason, and then bounced around the league to a few different teams, never establishing himself as a rotation player, and was last seen in the NBA in 2022. Speaking of players that didn't last long on their initial team, we move on to number 9 and the Charlotte Hornets. They, just like the Kings, needed any kind of talent they could get. They did make the playoffs the year before behind an all-NBA season from recently signed free agent Al Jefferson, and they had an emerging guard in Kemba Walker, but the other young talent wasn't great. They went with a big high upside swing here with Noah Vonleh at 9th overall. He was an extremely talented, athletic, and super raw forward that if he hit could raise the ceiling of the Hornets in the long term, but of course that did not happen. He played just 25 games at 10 minutes per game as a rookie, and it was clear that he wasn't ready to contribute at the NBA level. After that season, he was traded to the Trailblazers in exchange for Nick Batum, and although he has managed to stick around on NBA teams ever since, he's never really established himself as a legit rotation player, and it's pretty incredible to look back on this draft and see 2 players, both drafted in the top 10, only spend 1 full season with the team that drafted them in Stauskas and Vonleh. Moving on now to our first big draft night trade of this class. At number 10 overall, initially the Sixers were making this pick, but the Magic moved up from 12th to 10th, giving up an extra first-round pick in the process to go and get Elfrid Payton at 10. Payton was a really interesting prospect coming from a smaller school at Louisiana and becoming a top 10 pick mostly because of his defensive and passing instincts. The Magic were in desperate need of some guard help, as I mentioned earlier, and thought that Payton would be the perfect playmaker for the young talent that they were building while also fitting into their defensive identity. The problem was Payton couldn't shoot, like at all, and as the league began to change over the next few seasons, it turned out that that was kind of the number 1 skill that you wanted a guard to have in the NBA. Payton did have some good moments in Orlando, making an all-rookie team and putting up really good assist and steals numbers as a really unique kind of player, but the impact of his lack of spacing on the offense was just so hard to overcome given the other issues the Magic had on their roster. Despite some solid improvement over the years, Payton was dumped to the Suns for a 2nd-round pick halfway through his 4th season, and from there he was basically just a role player and was last seen in the NBA in 2022. I do think in a different era Payton could have been really successful, but he just wasn't a good fit in the modern NBA, and the trade up for him just did not work out at all for the Magic. Next up now is another draft night trade at number 11. The Denver Nuggets initially held this pick, but traded it in exchange for picks 16 and 19 in this draft. The Bulls moved up to 11, and the guy they wanted and selected was Doug McDermott. He was a fantastic college player for multiple years at Creighton and was one of the best scorers in the country the prior season, averaging over 26 points per game. His role at the NBA level was in question though, as his game was built around his skill level, and it was unlikely that his limited athleticism would allow him to be a big-time scorer in the NBA as well. The upside was that he was an older prospect and it looked like he was going to be ready to contribute right away, and he was a really good shooter. As it turned out, it actually took a while for McDermott to get his NBA career going. He played less than 10 minutes per game as a rookie and really struggled to make an impact, but in year 2 he came back strong and shot over 40% from 3, and at that point it was clear what his NBA role was going to be. Not a big time scorer, but as an elite floor spacer. He lasted just 2.5 years in Chicago before then being traded to the Thunder, then the Knicks, then Dallas, not making a big impact at any one place. But then he ended up in Indiana and finally became a reliable rotation player, which he still is as of this recording now with the Spurs. Credit to McDermott for changing his game completely and working hard on his game to carve out a solid NBA career as a three-point specialist, even if the expectations were higher for him as a lottery pick. And now we get to the other half of the Elfrid Payton trade from earlier at number 12. The Sixers now held this pick and they went with Dario Saric, a really intriguing international prospect. He was seen as this really cool combination of scoring, shooting, and passing that could really thrive in the right situation as a forward, and him ending up in Philadelphia was a good spot for him initially. It allowed the Sixers to continue the process because Saric didn't come to the NBA right away, and when he did show up, he had chances to expand his game since there wasn't a lot of talent around him. But when he did come to the NBA in 2016, I really liked his game and he impressed pretty much immediately. The problem was, over the years in Philly, things got a bit weird for him. He had good passing and playmaking instincts, but the roster with the Sixers really necessitated that he just basically become a spot-up shooter, and mostly that is what he did for years there, which was kind of a waste of his talent. Granted, the Sixers came out of the process and were really good, but I've wondered what his career would have looked like in a different situation. Ultimately, after a few good years with the team, they decided to trade him in a package for Jimmy Butler, and his career went downhill from there. After finishing the year in Minnesota, he ended up in Phoenix and later suffered a knee injury that cost him an entire season, and although he has stuck around the league, he's never been the same since leaving the Sixers and suffering the injury, making him one of the biggest what-ifs from this class. Speaking of the Timberwolves, they held the next pick at number 13 and went with Zach LaVine, who was seen as a really high upside player in this class, an incredible athlete with a developing offensive game, but also a huge risk to take in the lottery, considering he averaged less than 10 points per game in college as a freshman the year before. But as it turned out, this was an amazing pick by Minnesota, considering the other players selected around this point in the draft. LaVine established himself pretty quickly as a building block for the team, improving his scoring average each season and developing his all-around offensive game. Unfortunately, a knee injury ended his third season halfway through, and that would be his last year with the team. During the 2017 draft, the Timberwolves traded LaVine in a package for Jimmy Butler, which I talked about earlier with Wiggins, and at that point, as he recovered from his knee injury and now on a new team, his NBA future was pretty uncertain. But LaVine has turned out to be a great player for the Bulls, a high-level scorer and spacer that isn't quite on the level of an all-NBA caliber player, but certainly an extremely talented and effective guard. As of this recording, he's still a member of the Bulls, although there are some trade rumors swirling, but I really admire LaVine's ability to improve his game over the years, despite some tough injury and trade circumstances. Next up now is number 14, TJ Warren. The Suns held this pick and they were coming off of a 48-win season in which they still didn't make the playoffs in a loaded Western Conference. They had some talented guards like Goran Dragic, but what they really needed was a high-level wing, and Warren was a nice selection at this point. He was a high-level scorer in college at NC State and was coming off of a Conference Player of the Year season, and he was kind of a throwback kind of player. He loved to get to the mid-range and get to the rim, but wasn't a very good three-point shooter. But the Suns felt that they could develop that part of his game and end up with a good to great complementary score. The biggest problem for Warren early in his career was staying healthy, but once he got that figured out, it was clear he was going to be a good player. After a few seasons in the league, he was averaging close to 20 points per game and playing over 30 minutes per game, and even shot over 40% from three in the 2018-19 season. After that year, the Suns decided to move on and send him to Indiana, and in the 2019-20 season, Warren had his best year as a pro, most memorably going to the 2020 NBA bubble and putting up insane numbers in limited games. Unfortunately, injury issues did catch up to him again after that, and although he has stuck around in the league a little bit, his once promising career never quite lived up to the hype that it seemed to have at times early on, despite that great performance in the bubble. Next up now is a really overlooked player from this class at 16, Yousef Nurkic. This was one of the picks that the Nuggets got in their trade with the Bulls, moving back from number 11, and they turned both 16 and 19 into really good players for them. Nurkic was a bruising international big as a prospect with some sneaky passing instincts mixed in there as well. He established himself as a solid rotation player, but after a few seasons, things got awkward in Denver because of a guy that we're going to talk about later on in this class, Nikola Jokic. Both Nurkic and Jokic were clearly good after a few seasons, and they could not play together, although the Nuggets did try and make that work for a little bit. So Denver had to make a choice, and they chose to trade away Nurkic. He was sent to Portland in 2017 and had some really good years there as one of the more overlooked bigs in the league. He never did anything spectacular, but he was a good starting big for years, later being traded to the Suns in 2023 as the Trailblazers went into a rebuild post-Damian Lillard trade. Next up is the other part of the Bulls-Nuggets draft night trade at 19. The Nuggets went with Gary Harris here, who had 2 productive seasons at Michigan State and had a unique combination of upside as a younger player and a skill set as a shooter and defender that made it seem like he could be an immediate contributor. A rare combination for a player selected outside the lottery. And in Denver, he fulfilled his promise as a prospect, becoming a good scorer and solid two-way player on some good Nuggets teams before injuries unfortunately caused his career to be derailed a bit. He was sent to the Magic in 2021 after some really good years with the Nuggets in a trade for Aaron Gordon and has never really been the same since, dealing with even more injury issues and dwindling playing time and effectiveness with the Magic. Moving on now to number 24, Shabazz Napier. The Heat held this pick after a trade with the Hornets, and honestly, the only reason I'm including it is because it's kind of funny how LeBron asked the Heat to pick Napier because he really liked him in college, and then in the same offseason, he just left for the Cavs anyway. Napier never made much of an impact in the NBA despite his success in college, which is especially tough for the Heat because this class ended up producing a ton of good players past this point in the draft. Speaking of, with the very next pick, the Houston Rockets selected Clint Capella. He was seen as a very raw international prospect, and a lot of people thought this was a huge reach by the Rockets, selecting a big that at best projected as a solid rim rolling and rim protecting player. As it turned out, he became exactly that, and a really helpful and productive player for some good Rockets teams before being sent to Atlanta in 2020 to try and make the Russell Westbrook James Harden Rockets work. In Atlanta, Capella continued to do what he always has since becoming a starter a few seasons into his career, being a great role player starting center and awesome value at the 25th pick in this draft. Next up now at 27 is Bogdan Bogdanovic. This pick was made by the Suns, but he never actually played for them because he didn't come over to the NBA for a few seasons. Instead, his draft rights were traded to the Kings in 2016, and he made his NBA debut in 2017. Upon getting to the NBA, it was clear Bogdanovic was a good player. He could play make, shoot, was a nice complementary offensive option, and he had 3 really productive seasons with the Kings. They just didn't want to pay to keep him, so in the 2020 offseason, they worked to trade him first to the Bucks, but then that deal was canceled by the league and he was sent to the Hawks, where he has continued to be productive and honestly really overlooked as a solid starting guard in the NBA. Next up is the last pick in the first round before we get to an absolutely loaded second round in this draft, Kyle Anderson. The Spurs made this pick and selected a player in Anderson that was a really unique prospect. He was a good college player. He could score, shoot a little bit, was a great passer, but his athleticism left a lot to be desired. He had good size, but got the nickname Slow-Mo because he played in an extremely slow pace. As it turned out, that kind of worked for him in the NBA. He's been a really good complementary player in San Antonio, Memphis, and Minnesota, each time proving that his game, however strange it might seem, really helps him contribute at the NBA level. Moving on now to number 33, Joe Harris. He was a good college player that projected as a limited athlete that might find a role in the NBA as an elite shooter. He was picked by the Cavs here, but played just 56 games in 2 seasons before they gave up on him. The Nets then picked him up and developed him into one of the better role player shooters in the league, allowing him to have a nice few seasons in Brooklyn and carve out a solid NBA career. Speaking of the Nets, next up is Spencer Dinwiddie at 38th overall. A lot of people were actually really excited about him as a prospect. Initially, a combo guard with good size and skill that looked like he could be a high-level NBA starter if things went well. The issue was he was coming off a knee injury that he suffered in college, which scared off a lot of teams. The Pistons took him here at 38, but just like Harris, the team gave up on him after just 2 seasons, and he found his way to Brooklyn and developed into exactly what he was supposed to be as a prospect. He then moved on to the Wizards, Mavericks, and then back to the Nets with varying degrees of success, but Dinwiddie is a solid guard that ended up being great value at the 38th overall pick. The very next pick now is one of my favorite players from this class, Jeremy Grant. The Sixers picked him here to round out a great draft class for them, along with Embiid and Saric, and Grant at the time was seen as an extremely athletic frontcourt player without much of an offensive game, and his fit at the NBA level was in serious doubt as a result. But this is what the Sixers did during the process era. They took guys with upside and tried to develop them over the years into good role players, and that's exactly what happened with Grant. All he did in his career was just get better every season, carving out a role in Philly for his first few years, then ending up in OKC and improving offensively, then getting traded to the Nuggets and becoming a great two-way player, then signing with the Pistons and putting up big scoring numbers, then traded to the Trailblazers to go back to being a solid two-way player. The development of Grant's offensive game from where he was as a prospect to where his scoring numbers were during his time in Detroit is nothing short of incredible, making him one of my favorite stories from this class. And now we get to the greatest draft pick of all time, an MVP that was selected while a Taco Bell commercial was running on the draft broadcast. 41st overall, Nikola Jokic to the Denver Nuggets. As a prospect, Jokic was seen as an unathletic, out-of-shape big with solid skill. Nothing super impressive, but if you could get in better shape, he'd have a chance to be a rotation big and maybe even a starter. Again, just think about the fact that guys like Yousef Nurkic and Clint Capella went a ton of picks before Jokic. He didn't come to the league until the 2015-16 season, but once he did, it was clear that the Nuggets had something. There weren't talks of him being an MVP or anything, but it was clear they needed to prioritize him more within the future of their team. So they traded Nurkic, as I talked about earlier, and over the years he continued to improve and earn more minutes, developing into one of the best passers in the league, a good floor spacer, and an elite offensive weapon. It took some time to figure out how to make things work with him defensively, but eventually it all came together for him in the 2020-21 season, and he went on to become the MVP of the league and arguably the best player in the NBA, all as a former second-round pick whose selection wasn't even shown on TV during the draft. His rise from 41st overall to where he is now as an MVP and a champion is one of the most unlikely outcomes from any draft ever. One more pick now, 46th overall, is Jordan Clarkson. This was originally the Wizards pick, but it was dumped to the Lakers for cash, and it was a great decision by LA. Clarkson was seen as a possible bench scorer in the league, coming in as an older prospect with a developed offensive game, and immediately he delivered on that. He was good for 3.5 years in LA before being traded to Cleveland and then Utah, and at each spot he's been a high-level scorer either off the bench or as a starter. Long, productive NBA careers in the second round are hard to come by, and Clarkson has made it work as one of the best guards in this entire class. And that is what happened to the 2014 NBA draft.